Hello and welcome to the second part of the video series in which I make this, oh darn it, I'm doing it again, in which I make this 1890s outfit. You can see I'm wearing it, a little sneaky preview of it. I just finished it last night and I actually recorded this bit right after I'd finished it, but I was filming from kind of up underneath my face and it made it look like I have a double chin. And I don't want to look like I have a double chin because I don't. Although some of the most famous beauties in history either had double chins or have been portrayed as having them, like Venus or Catherine Howard, but that's beside the point. The point is the bodice is done, or the jacket is done. Now, I have been a little bit neglectful in my past few videos, ever since the Korean bodice video, to talk about the kind of histories of fabrics. That's because I've been working with wool and silk again in those videos, so there hasn't been anything new to say as far as silk is concerned. And with wool, you know, I'm not aware of any history of terribleness involving wool, unless it be terrible treatment of sheep, and even then that doesn't really make sense because the happier and healthier the sheep are, the better quality the wool is. So it's actually in the wool farmers, or the sheep farmers' best interest to treat their sheep well. I do use cotton linings, but as of the 1890s, cotton was no longer morally reprehensible. I don't see any reason to beat about the bush any farther, so I think we should just get into the video. And very, very briefly, this video is going to start off with me talking about my altered pattern. This is because I made several mock-ups of this jacket before actually launching into the real thing, as you do. And I thought I recorded that. Apparently I didn't, or if I did, the recording got lost, but I used those to alter the pattern ever so slightly. So you haven't really missed anything, just me making minute adjustments to the pattern. But that's why I'm talking about my altered pattern. Now, first, I would ask you to please ignore the complete and utter shambles that is my sewing room. But here you see my altered pattern laid out on the fabric. That is the front right there. And then over here we have the back and, of course, the side back. Now, the back and the side back are laid out on scraps of fabric that I had left over from making the skirt and bodice out of this same fabric. This large square of fabric here is the lion's share of the leftover fabric, and a majority of that is going to be taken up by the sleeve. That's the sleeve mock-up that I have right there, and the sleeves are about a full yard of fabric each, so much of this fabric is going to be eaten up by the sleeve. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough scrap to fit the front on without piecing it, but that wasn't a problem. I still had plenty of fabric in which I could fit the front and the sleeve, and even if I did run out of fabric, which I didn't, but if I did, I could have still pieced the sleeve. I feel most comfortable piecing sleeves since that's where it's going to be least noticeable. So I could have done that if I'd needed to, but fortunately I did not end up needing to do that because there was plenty of fabric left. I also broke with personal tradition by adding seam allowances to the pattern pieces. Usually I have the pattern pieces without seam allowance and then I add that on just by using rulers when I'm tracing out the pattern, but I actually added the seam allowance to the pattern piece this time. Because this jacket has that type of lining where you essentially make a whole other garment and then put it inside out into your garment, I thought that I wouldn't have to flatline it, but I turned out to be wrong about that, and I'm going to be quite disappointed about that in just a second. Because I had actually sewed the back and side back together, so I had to undo all of that. As I promised, I was wrong, and I did in fact end up needing to flatline this piece, and that was for several reasons. One of them was because this wool was quite stretchy, and I didn't trust it not to buckle and shift along the seams without some sort of stiffer fabric to make sure it held its shape. Also, this wool does not like to be ironed. I could dunk it in water and leave it under the iron for 7 minutes and it would still just pop right back into place. So if I want the seams to lay flat, I'm going to need to whip them down to something, so I need to have flat lining there so I don't end up whipping it down to itself. So I did end up having to unstitch the back and the side pieces, put the flat lining on, and stitch them back together. After I'd gotten all of the pieces flat lined and the back and the side backs all stitched together, it was time for me to start working on lapels, and this was my first time pad stitching, so I did the first pad stitching, the first lapel off camera so I could kind of get a feel for it, and then I brought you guys along for the second one. So this is the first lapel that I did, the one off camera, and I think that it looks quite nice, don't you? The black velvet and the kind of off black wool go so nicely together. I'm very, very pleased with this combination. And the pad stitching went better than I could have ever hoped. I'm going to flip it in just a second. Yeah, so you can see there is some pad stitching down there, and when it focuses, you'll be able to see all of the lines of the little pad stitches. So that went better than I ever could have hoped. There's the back. I didn't bother finishing that edge because it's going to be covered by a lining later. So it's time to take you along on the journey for the second one. I had some difficulty in getting the lapel pattern piece to actually fit onto the horsehair canvas interfacing. I used horsehair canvas because everybody else does, but you can see that the pattern piece is just slightly too long, and I didn't want to piece the horsehair because I was afraid that would make it bulky. I ended up having to do that, and it turned out fine. But what's more important is you can see I'm making a mistake here. You see those white ridges in the horsehair? Those are supposed to be going horizontally, not vertically. So I actually cut this out wrong and had to go back and do some mega piecing with the horsehair canvas and get it right. And you can see I've corrected the problem, and I've also done the first step, which is to back stitch along the fold line. So I'm going to start with the pad stitching. I generally start kind of in the middle and then work my way out. You have to be sure to prick not only the canvas layer, but also your other fabric layer with the stitches, and be sure to wrap the fold line around your finger so it will do this. Otherwise it will just lay flat. And so the pad stitching is done and looks how pad stitching should. Those big stitches down at the bottom are just there to hold the canvas in place. They're not doing any shaping. They're not going through to the wool. They're just tacking the canvas down to the interlining so it won't go floating all over the place. The littler stitches, on the other hand, are doing shaping, and you can see how well that works. They're going through the canvas, the interlining, and the wool layer, and they're causing the lapel to have that really nice roll over backwards. So it is just so incredibly satisfying to look at, don't you think? So then it's going to get covered with the velvet. I'm having a little bit of trouble handling the velvet one-handed, but it's going to get covered with the velvet, but I didn't want velvet piles sticking out around the bottom of the lapel, kind of at the bottom of the jacket, so I sliced off the bottom of the velvet lapel and replaced it with this little bit of wool. And because velvet is famously very challenging to wrangle through a sewing machine, I had to sew it by hand. It's just pinned right there, but I'm going to sew it by hand. And then because you can't really iron velvet down, and because this wool doesn't like to iron it down, I just kind of stitched the seam allowances down to their respective sides. I also left some allowance around the edges where there wasn't any stitching, because I'm going to cut that off to make room for the velvet to get sewn on, because you don't want to sew the velvet on over the horsehair canvas, because that means when you turn it inside out, you're going to have a very, very bulky seam. So just a little bit of it is going to get cut off, and then the velvet is going to get stitched on only to the wool and to the interlining. I ran some top stitching around the outer edges of the lapels, and then I pinned the front to the back, and it was time to stitch them all together. So at this point, the jacket has been assembled, and I think it looks quite nice, but I did a try on, and I found that this dart there was not lying flat, and I tried repinning it in 1,000 different ways to get it to lie correctly. I could not make it work, so I came to the conclusion that I would have to pad that part out, which I didn't want to do, but it was necessary. However, that couldn't be done until after I'd gotten the sleeves on, so that had to wait for a little while longer. So it's still going to be a little while before I get the sleeves and the padding on. I also still have to do the collar, and the collar is done very, very similarly to the lapels. It's pad stitched on the horsehair canvas. You just stitch along the fold line and make sure it's folded in the pad stitchy way. So collar's next. This is the collar. That line there on the horsehair canvas is the fold line. Then that black part is the kind of underside wool part. And the pattern instructions said to cut the collar on the fold, but I've seen videos from several different tailors saying that you should cut the collar in two pieces, the collar interlining and the collar kind of bottom part in two pieces, and then just cut the fashion fabric on the fold. So that's what I've done. So you can see how it's going to go together. So that's going to be the bottom part of the collar there, then that is going to be inside and the velvet will go on top of there. So the next step is to back stitch along this line and then just pad stitch as usual along the channels created by the white stripes in the horsehair canvas. And there's the finished collar, ready now for the velvet. And here you see the collar has been velveted and it has been attached to the rest of the jacket. And I didn't film this process for two reasons. One, it was very, very straightforward and I thought it would be kind of boring. But more importantly, although it was straightforward, it was very fiddly and I just didn't want to have to think about filming while I was also really wrangling this together. I stitched it on by hand because I wasn't comfortable trying to get it through the sewing machine. But it's on and anybody could really figure out how to put it on. There were no real surprises. It was just a finicky process. The next order of business is going to be to deal with the seam allowances. So I said before that I'm going to overcast them or kind of whip them down to the lining. Even though this is going to be fully lined, I still need to do that. It's not to keep them from fraying, but it's because this cotton or this wool just will not stay ironed. So to keep the seams from being bulky, I need to have them whipped down to the interlining. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the little triangle cuts at any points of curvature, and then I'm going to iron them down as best as I can and whip them to the interlining. I also needed to deal with the bust dart. I usually just leave darts as they are, just kind of iron them to the side and leave them, but these ones were so big and bulky that they were making the jacket lie strangely. So I needed to reduce that bulk. So I decided that I was just going to cut them along right around where my finger is running there and iron them flat as I could, open, and whip them down to the interlining in much the same way that I did with the other seams. I was a little bit worried about cutting it that high up. I was afraid that it would fray and ruin the jacket, but I decided not to cut it really anywhere past that stitch line that you can see kind of hiding underneath my knuckle right there. Also, those fears were probably misplaced because people have been doing this kind of thing with their darts for literally hundreds of years, and as far as I know, it's never had any ill effects. So everything should be fine, and I've had no ill effects as of yet from doing that. And here is what the seam allowances look like when they've been clipped and overcast, and also that's the bust score right there. It's just a really, really quick and dirty job. It's not supposed to look nice. It's not supposed to control fraying. It's just meant to keep the wool down and flat and in place. I also hemmed it. It is also not a very nice job on the inside because, again, that's going to be covered by a lining. The next order of business were the sleeves, and there you can see the mock-up that I made for the sleeve pattern. I had to lengthen it by a few inches. I always have to do this because I have pretty long arms, so now before even making the sleeve mock-up, I just, as a matter of course, add a few extra inches to the cuff. Also, where I'm gesturing with my foot there, that part was much too tight, so I had to widen that bit. I didn't bother making a whole new pattern for that. I was just going to kind of sketch a line where I needed to widen the pattern onto the wool, and then I was going to use that wool pattern as a template to cut out the interlining pieces. Speaking of the interlinings, here they are, pieced very, very crazily. These sleeves taper into the cuff in a way that I've never seen before. If you see those there, those are actually darts. I've never seen sleeves taper in using darts. And I have a special method of getting perfect darts that I'm going to show you. So I'm going to prepare it and then show you what it looks like when it's ready. So you see I've done a ladder stitch along the dart, so then all I need to do to make it into an actual dart is to pull the thread, and it meets. And then of course I'll go over and sew this with actual sewing machine thread. This is just basting. But it's a very, very clever trick, and I can't take credit for it. It was invented by somebody. I cannot remember who. The sleeve darts have been stitched and clipped, and now I'm going to deal with them in exactly the same way that I dealt with the bust darts. Just iron them down as best as I can, and then whip them down to the interlining so they stay flat. So I've whipped the dart edges down to the interlining, and now I'm going to go over them with an iron to melt any wax that is left on the threads, and that's always an incredibly satisfying step. I really, really enjoy doing that. I've put the right hand sleeve on, and at the risk of sounding like Mr. Keystone, I did that in the usual way, but I will bring you along for the attaching of the left hand sleeve, just in case, shockingly, you don't know what the usual way is. Horror of horrors. What I always do is I sew on the bottom part of the sleeve, the non-gathered part of the sleeve first, and then I will run the gathering stitches around the part that needs to be gathered and sew that part on. And that has always worked very, very well for me. And for this bodice, I'm actually using silk thread for the gathering threads. I've never done this before, but I had several reasons for doing so. One, the gathering threads stay in, and I'm going to try to show them to you on the right-hand sleeve in a second, and you won't be able to see them, but they do stay in, and if by chance anybody does see them, you know, I want them to be a nice silk thread and not some like crusty, waxy cotton thread. That's fine for the interior seams where I can iron the wax away, but I can't really iron the wax away from these gathering threads. Also, silk thread is very, very strong, and there's a lot of fabric that needs to be gathered down, and also the sleeves are slightly too big for the arm size, so I'm going to need to pull pretty hard, so I wanted a really durable thread, and silk is, as far as I know, the most durable type of thread. Also, silk is significantly less prone to knot. There I am, I'm trying to show you the gathering threads, and you cannot see them at all. Silk is also significantly less prone to fraying. I always say prone to fraying. It's significantly less prone to fraying than, or to knotting up. That was entirely unnecessary. Silk is significantly less prone to knotting up and tangling up than cotton is. And there is just such a massive amount of sleeve that I need to gather down. I did not want to have to deal with getting any knots in my gathering threads. I also pinned the cuff up, and there's no like facing on there or anything. It's just turned up and pinned, and I'm going to whip it down to the interlining. I'm probably going to, I ended up cutting away some of the fabric that's in there because it goes up to all the way where my thumb is, and I cut it down to about where the pins are. But I just whipped that turned up cuff to the interlining. There was no point in putting a facing on there since it's going to be covered with another lining later. Somehow my arm size also kind of moved down lower than they're supposed to, so I chalked on a mark there to indicate how high up I need to cut away to get the shoulder to sit correctly. This is because sleeve seams and shoulder seams in the 1890s tended to sit very high up on the shoulder, almost onto the collarbone. This is how you can tell the difference between 1890s puffed sleeves and 1830s puffed sleeves. In the 1830s, the puffed sleeves tended to start much lower down, which would give the sleeve a much more kind of downward and outward motion, whereas in the 1890s, the sleeve puffs start higher up, giving them a much more upwards and outwards motion. So in the 1830s, the puffed shoulders were almost more like puffed arms, whereas in the 1890s, it is a true shoulder puff. The sleeves are on, and that means it's time to start the padding because I need to pad this part out. Why do my mirrors look so much more dirty on the camera than they do in real life? You're gonna think I'm a terrible housekeeper, but it really does not look dirty in real life. So I just need to pad this part out because I could not make it lie flat. Same over here. Just this little bit there. So I'm gonna use polyfill. I know, but I got it to stuff my bustle pad. And oh, wait a minute. Can I make this work? I'm making sure that I'm in focus by using the reflection of my phone in the mirror. So I got that stuff to fill my bustle pad, and I looked all over for cotton batting or wool fluff or anything accurate, but I just could not find anything. So I had to go with the polyfill, and now I've got a ton of it left, so I want to use it up. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pad this in, and I've been wearing this waistcoat today just to kind of, for Christ, Okay, we're doing this again. I've been wearing a waistcoat today, just kind of test run it, and I've decided that I need to figure out how to make the collar meet in the middle like I was originally planning, because this overlap thing is not working. Also, it keeps on collapsing, so I need to put some boning into it. So luckily, I don't think that'll take very long. But first things first, I'm going to do the padding in the bust darts in this jacket, and then after I have done that, all I'll need to do is make the lining. So there are the pads. They just look like little pillows. And at this point, the jacket is structurally done, but it wouldn't last for very long if I didn't put in the other lining. It would just kind of fray away into nothingness. But I didn't want to put in that other lining until I'd worn it for a little bit, just to make sure that it didn't need any adjustment. So I decided to wear it to go crisis caroling. And that's essentially just like Christmas caroling, but it's about climate change instead of Christmas. And I think that I am very brave to put in this next clip, so you guys had better be nice about it. Come and behold this climate crisis, so come let us demand change, oh come let us demand change, oh come let us demand change for the world. So I did that for about 2 hours, and the bodice worked great. Nothing needed to be adjusted, so it was time to put in the lining. Now, normally jackets like this would be lined with some sort of pretty or brightly colored silk. That just felt kind of excessive to me, and I couldn't have afforded that. So I just got this cotton sateen from Mill End. I actually originally got a different kind of cotton sateen, but I decided that I liked that too much to use it as a lining. So I got this one instead, and I bought that other cotton sateen, and then I went back a little bit later and bought all of the rest of that cotton sateen, so I'm going to be having a project made out of that later. But for purposes of linings, I'm using this kind of gray cotton sateen. Just a cameo appearance of the other cotton sateen that I bought that will soon become a dress. I just think that is such a beautiful fabric. Back to the actual video. Here's the lining. I did it entirely by machine, even the gathering stitches. That is the outside, which is actually the inside, and then the other side there, that's the inside, which is actually the outside, but it's going to be on the inside. So that part is going to be the part that is like towards my body, and the other part, that part is going to be the part that's towards the wool of the outer fabric. So that's the part that's not going to be seen. I did the gathering stitches even by machine because, like I said, nobody's gonna see them, even though they look quite messy, and I generally prefer to do gathering stitches by hand. It's fine for something that nobody's gonna see. Also, those lapels are going to get cut off. They don't need to be there, so right around that line where my finger is tracing, that's where it's gonna get cut off. But not yet, not until I've actually put it into the jacket and made sure of where it needs to be, because I don't want to cut off too much. Measure twice, cut once. And the lining is sewn in, and doesn't that look so pretty? I wore it around for a couple more days to see if anything else needed alteration, and it turned out that some more things did need alteration. I realized that the pad stitching was just not going to cut it for keeping the lapels in shape. The problem with the 1890s is that everything is just so oversized. The lapels ended up hitting against the sleeves, and the sleeves kept on wanting to force the lapels to fold forward. So the pad stitching was enough to get them to fold backwards, but that only lasted to about as far as I was just gesturing. So what I did was I sewed in this bone right here. If I'd been smart, I would have put it in beforehand, but I didn't. I'll probably go back over that sometime and cover it with black so it doesn't look so noticeable. But the pad stitching is keeping the lapel rolling backwards, and this is just keeping it from collapsing when it's hitting against the sleeve. So I don't know if it's historically accurate. I don't know if they did lapels like this back then. I do know that they had baleen and that they had lapels, so it's historically plausible. I also altered the neck of the waistcoat like I said I would. I made it so it just meets in the middle, it doesn't overlap, and it was challenging. There's a lot of crazy piecing going on in there that I think you'll see in a little bit, but I did make it work. Also, I took stiffer fabric and just applied it to the collar, to the inside of the collar, to just give it a little bit more body. It was basically just a lining, and I turned the original lining into an interlining, and that helped a lot, but even that didn't fix everything. So I also put in some boning into the collar just to hold it stiff. I also moved some of the buttons. You can see there I didn't even bother to take out the old button threads. I just moved the buttons to make it a little bit more snugly fitting across the bust. So that waistcoat fits much better now. And here's what the waistcoat looks like on the inside with all of the alterations. You can see the pieces of boning. I might put one in the center back if it proves necessary, although I don't think it will. You can also see there my little stitches holding the stiffer fabric onto the much more flimsy fabric that was originally the lining.
Now, the original plan was to have these shell buttons that a friend of mine gave me. Well, she didn't actually give me the buttons. She gave me a coat that had these buttons on it, but the coat was all moth-eaten, so I just took the buttons off and got rid of the coat. The plan was to have these along this part of the jacket, but I thought that they didn't look quite right. So I went to my patrons and asked them what they thought, buttons or no buttons, and they said yes, buttons, but make them velvet covered. So I did. I went out and bought some buttons and covered them in velvet and put them on, and then I realized that I should probably show you how I did it. But luckily, I also got these smaller buttons to go on the cuffs, so I'm going to cover them in velvet the same way, so I'm going to show you how I did that.
First, I cut out a lining fabric slightly larger than the button itself. I then used the lining fabric as a template to cut out the velvet, and repeated this step 6 times. Then, after running a gathering thread around the edge of each one of the button covers and gathering the fabric around the button, I sewed the button onto the sleeve of the jacket or the lapel of the jacket, depending on which one, by just catching the velvet all the way around. And with that, the jacket is completed. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe and turn on the notification bell. A big thank you to Mary Royal and Kit Kat Stitch for supporting this channel on Patreon. If you have a lot of extra money lying around and you would also like to support the channel, there's a link in the description below. If you can't, no worries, I completely understand. I don't want you to, give money if you can't afford to. If you enjoyed this video, I'm going to also leave a link to a video that Costube made about the process of making this same jacket. I don't think that there's anything else I need to say. So, yeah. Let's move on to let's roll the vanity footage.